Good evening, everybody. I'm Betsy Fischer Martin, the Executive Director of the Women in Politics Institute here at American University. And I want to welcome you all to our virtual series, Women on Wednesdays. We are so glad that you're here. To those of you new to one of our events, WPI is a nonprofit and nonpartisan institute in AU School of Public Affairs that aims to close the gender gap in political leadership. And we offer academic and political campaign training, and we facilitate research and discussions like this on women in politics and leadership. And tonight we want to spend some time with two women leaders on a mission to stop the silencing of victims of toxic work environments. After they both filed and settled sexual harassment cases against their former employer, Fox News, they created an organization in 2019 called Lift Our Voices, which seeks to change the system of workplace NDAs and forced arbitration clauses. They'll explain why this is so important to making workplaces safer and more equitable for everybody. And we're thrilled to have with us Gretchen Carlson and Julie Roginsky this evening to talk about their experience, their mission, how others can get involved, and what you need to be aware of when you sign employment contracts. Before we start, we want to let you know that we're going to save plenty of time for your questions. So at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll notice the Q&A button. You can ask a question there. So please do so during the discussion and we'll get to as many as possible. You can also upvote other people's questions that you are interested into as well. So Gretchen, Julie, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you.
Appreciate it. Gretchen, let me start with you, roll back the clock here, and give us a sense. You really, in many ways, launched the Me Too movement when you decided to sue Roger Ailes and Fox News back in 2016. Tell us how that experience has taken you to this place and starting Lift Our Voices and what you're working on now.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having us, Betsy.
Sure.
When I decided to jump off the cliff, I had no idea how it was going to end up. I don't think anyone could ever imagine what the repercussions would be. But the way I sort of sum it up is, other than being incredibly surreal, is that it has ended up as positive as it possibly could have in my wildest dreams. And what I mean by that is the movement that was started, and for whatever part I played in igniting that, you know, I'm glad that I did, but I also want to honor all these other women who reached out to me afterwards and started telling me their same stories of shame and pain and agony and never working again. I mean, I'd also like to credit Tarana Burke for coming up with the term Me Too. And you know, that was 10 years prior. But it really was all these women that started reaching out to me that provided me with this safety net that I didn't know I was going to have. And I didn't realize that harassment in the workplace was an epidemic. And right. That's when immediately I rolled up my sleeves and I was like, holy crap, I got to do something about this. And I guess I can thank my Midwestern upbringing and parents who always told me you can be whatever you want to be. And I used that to start creating this major advocacy movement to make workplaces safer. And what we figured out was that these silencing mechanisms inside of almost all of our workplace contracts were really the culprit in keeping harassment, discrimination, any kind of toxic workplace issues silent. Mm-hmm. And so that's been our mission to try and eradicate both of those things, NDAs and forced arbitration.
Julie, tell us how you and Gretchen came together. You all were colleagues at Fox, so I know you all knew each other, but how did you come together on this particular mission?
Well, if I could roll back the clock even before that, I was still at Fox when Gretchen filed her lawsuit. Actually,
right.
I was getting ready to go on the show that she hosted, and I thought she wasn't there because she was on vacation. About 5 seconds before I was about to go on air, the news broke that she had done this incredible thing and sued Roger Ailes for sexual harassment. And I had two reactions. My first reaction was, oh my God, this woman is going to get killed. She's just going to be eviscerated. And I felt sorry for her and thought she was a little crazy. And my second reaction was, which I think so many other women feel in these kinds of situations, oh my God, so it's not just me. This has happened before and happened to other people. And as a result of that, just watching what Gretchen was able to accomplish, that this one woman took on the most powerful man in media, and not just was able to win she didn't have a case, but win the argument, but also the fact that she did help kick off this iteration of the Me Too movement, I thought was incredibly powerful. And it gave me the strength to do what I ended up doing about 10 months later. Certainly gave so many other women around the country and even the world the strength to do what they then did against people like Harvey Weinstein and others, very, very powerful men. So after Gretchen and I settled our cases, she and I stayed in touch, and we looked around and realized that the issues that we were hearing from so many women on, and we probably have heard from thousands of women by this point, 5 years later, so many women were in the same boat as we were, but they weren't able to share their stories. They weren't able to get their day in court, and they certainly weren't able to discuss the circumstances of their harassment or racial discrimination or gender discrimination with others because they were bound by these silencing mechanisms, these confidentiality clauses that are stuck in contracts that you're not even aware of. I wasn't even aware of these being in my contract until I had to be, unfortunately. And we realized that we're never going to solve this problem, and it's a crisis in this country, a crisis of silence. And an epidemic of silence, unless we get rid of these silencing mechanisms, bring to light that they exist, educate people about the fact that they are prevalent and almost epidemic in our lives and in our workplaces. And so we looked around and realized nobody's really focused on these issues in a laser focused way that we wanted to be. And so in 2019, we decided that since nobody else was doing it, we were going to do it. And this has been not just a passion project, but almost a full-time job for both of us. And we're going to keep at it until we get it banned, until we get the workplace transformed so that we protect survivors and not predators who are currently being protected through these silencing mechanisms.
And there's the two prongs of the NDAs and the arbitration clauses. Let me just stay with you, Julie, on the NDA component of it, because the irony is, you and Gretchen can't really even talk about your settlements because you signed an NDA when you had your settlement, and that prevents you from even talking about it to this day, correct?
It does, and it's very strange seeing people write stories about us, make movies about us,
right.
Talk about our lives, and we can't respond. I mean, we can't tell you whether what people are saying, people who are portraying us in movies, whether they're doing it accurately or in any way, shape, or form, talk about these stories. What's fascinating, though, is, we're fine. Gretchen and Julie are going to be just fine. Who is not going to be fine is the woman who complains about being sexually harassed, is promptly forced into arbitration or in other ways bound to an NDA where she can't discuss it. And when she applies for her next job and somebody says, well, why did you leave the job where you worked for 10, 20, 30 years? Right. She has to say to her prospective boss, I can't tell you. That woman's never going to get hired because it looks like she did something wrong and she's trying to keep secret. Whereas in fact, it's the system that's precluding her from speaking up. And not just that, but it's protecting so many predators in the workforce because she can't discuss with her coworkers what's happening to her. Which is brutal and it's awful. And that's something that we want to change. We should really bring the sunlight into these kinds of discussions so that people understand that if they do something wrong, they're going to be held accountable and not the person to whom they're doing it.
And how prevalent are these NDAs and employment contracts now? And when did we really start to see the rise of them?
So over a third of American workers are bound by NDAs, which is astounding. And most of them don't realize what they're bound by. A lot of people think they're bound by confidentiality provisions that just protect trade secrets.
Right.
But they're so expansive that now they're protecting everything. including bad behavior, sometimes and often actually including the very existence of the NDA. You can't discuss that you have an NDA. We trace this back to the Anita Hill hearings, and it really began in the early 90s when, unfortunately, people took the wrong lesson from Anita Hill. A lot of people watched what happened to her and said, oh my goodness, this woman is empowering so many other women to speak up and say no more, and she's not going to be sexually harassed. A lot of companies looked at Anita Hill and said, oh my God, we cannot have an Anita Hill in our midst. And the way to prevent an Anita Hill from coming forward is to make workers sign these very, very strict, what they call confidentiality provisions, which basically prevent an Anita Hill from saying that she can't, from not being able to talk about what happened to her. I mean, had she been bound by an NDA, she might have thought twice about coming forward, because she wouldn't want to get sued by her boss or by anybody else who she sued or who she signed the contract with. So that's when it began, and that's when it advanced. And now it's become so prevalent in employment contracts that unfortunately it's become the way of the world, and that's what we want to change.
Gretchen,
Betsy, I would just add for the stats for forced arbitration clauses. I bet if I asked,
explain what that is though first.
Sorry, I didn't want to jump in, but I wanted to give you the stats on it because they are staggering. So in 1991, 2% of all companies used forced arbitration clauses. By 2024, 84% of corporate America will silence its workers with forced arbitration clauses. That's the epidemic that we're in unless we stop them, which I'm working on and we're working on at Lift Our Voices, which is the nonprofit that we formed 2 years ago to take on this mission. So forced arbitration, what is it? I bet if we could see everyone's hands and I said, raise your hand if you know whether or not you have a forced arbitration clause in your contract or not, nobody would raise their hand because nobody knows. So Fox put a forced arbitration clause in my last contract at Fox. I didn't have one before. I asked my agent, what is this? Because I'm very much into detail. She said, oh, don't worry about it. It's becoming the way of the world. Well, she was right. But I was already contemplating my lawsuit, but I didn't even understand, as a highly educated woman, the ramifications of having a forced arbitration clause and how that might preclude me from actually bringing a lawsuit. And when I finally got together with my lawyers, they looked at me and they said, we have some very bad news for you. And I said, what? And they said, you do not have a case. And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, you have a forced arbitration clause, which means you're going over here to this secret chamber of arbitration. You're not allowed to go to an open jury process, which actually is your 7th Amendment right. You are going to go over here and nobody's ever going to hear from you ever again. It's a secret chamber. There are not the same amount of witnesses or depositions. There's no legal precedent being set. There's no legal record. There are no appeals. And the company picks the arbitrator for you, which tend to be older white guys who are retired judges and lawyers, not a jury of your peers. And the silence protects the predator. You're no longer going to work at this company. They're going to be able to say whatever the hell they want about you. And that's that. No one will ever know your story. A dark day. So that's why we sued Roger Ailes personally, to try to circumvent the arbitration clause, but only because there was a specific law in the books in the state of New York that allowed me to do that. Most people, and this is why we're doing this work, most people don't have the resources or the national platform or the lawyers to be able to come up with that kind of a strategy. And the staggering statistics show that, of course, no surprise, women are bound by a forced arbitration clauses way more than men. What do you think the #1 industry is where they have the least amount of forced arbitration? Construction. Yeah. And why? Because men predominantly work in construction. And African Americans are bound, more than 60% of all African American workers are bound by forced arbitration. Minimum wage workers. This really runs the gamut. It's not just people on Wall Street and well-known journalists. This is fast food workers and police officers and firefighters and teachers, and it's everywhere. So that's what we're fighting to change.
And Julie, you've said that you would probably not have even been able to bring your suit because the lawyers don't want to take cases that have these arbitration clauses in them.
Yeah, I mean, what's fascinating, thank you for raising that. What's fascinating about this is when I went to first approached a lawyer about suing Roger Ailes, and it was Gretchen's lawyer. I mean, this is a woman who had already done Nancy Arca-Smith, who was a lawyer from both Gretchen's and my cases, but she had already done Gretchen's case. She knew the evidence. She obviously understood that I had a valid case. Right. First thing she said to me was, do you have an arbitration clause in your contract? And I said, I actually don't know, which most people don't, it never even occurred to me. She said, if you do, I'm sorry, but no matter how good your case is, I'm not going to be able to take it. And I was shocked. And I said, but why? I have all this evidence and why? And she said, because you're not going to win, because the deck is stacked against you. There's no point. And she was right. Luckily, I did not, I don't know why they forgot or avoided putting an arbitration clause on my contract, but they did, which is the only reason you know about my case now. If they hadn't, I would have been put into force. I probably wouldn't even gone forward because no lawyer would have taken my case, or very few lawyers would have taken my case. Or if they had, what would have happened, the statistics are staggering, as Gretchen said, of all arbitration cases, of all cases that are bound by arbitration, only 2% actually go to arbitration. So think about it. That's a staggering number to begin with. Of that 2%, there was a study done that said only 2.5% result in any kind of monetary compensation for the person bringing the arbitration case. So of course, lawyers understand this, and they understand full well that it's almost a fool's errand to go through arbitration. You're not going to win. And what's going to happen is you're going to be pushed out of your job with an NDA, not being able to say a word, and not being able to get a job, and your career will effectively be over. That's what we're doing to women, as Gretchen mentioned, people of color, workers making $13 or less an hour. That's what we're doing to people who are already disenfranchised in society to begin with, when we put them into arbitration. It's awful. And most people don't realize it because most people, as I didn't, are even aware that they have these clauses in their contracts or what they mean.
And Gretchen, you've essentially turned into like a full-time lobbyist. You're up on the Hill constantly. Tell us about this new legislation that you have been working tirelessly on to end this forced arbitration.
Yeah, thank you. So the news flash is that it's bipartisan. You know, what the hell is bipartisan anymore? Nothing except this bill that I've been the champion of for the last 4 years. So it was first introduced in the House and the Senate at the end of 2017. It didn't get a tremendous amount of traction there. As we all know, a lot of other stuff was going on in DC over the last 3 to 4 years. But it was reintroduced this past July. And I just want to give a shout out to the co-sponsors, because I always say it's strange bedfellows. It's probably the only thing they agree on, but Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Kirsten Gillibrand are the co-sponsors of my legislation in the Senate, and Representative Sherry Bustos, Democrat from Illinois, and Representative Morgan Griffith, Republican from Virginia, in the House. It was reintroduced, and it's really been moving swiftly now. So it went out of Senate Judiciary Committee on November 4th. 2 weeks later, it went out of House Judiciary Committee. To back up to Senate Judiciary Committee, it was unanimous. I mean, it was an unbelievably emotional experience for me to be there. The bill essentially would eradicate forced arbitration for harassment and assault and give people a choice about whether or not they want to go to the secret chamber or they want to be able to go to a jury of their peers. And I believe that the time is now that we should give people that choice, because through talking about this openly is the only way we're going to solve this issue. So I was able to get 5 Republicans that day to not only support the bill on judiciary, but to co-sponsor the bill. I now have 10 Republicans in the Senate who are co-sponsoring this legislation. This is going to pass when it gets to the Senate. And the House is actually voting on this bill on Tuesday. And so I have spent the last 4 years, but especially the last 6 months, in person, on the phone, over Zoom, working my fool head off to try and get as many Republicans as possible to support this bill, because it tends to be more of a Democratic issue. But I'll tell you, Betsy, I've seen a tonal shift since I first started advocating for this legislation, especially amongst Republicans, because the first question I ask to them when I'm testifying is, raise your hand if you're in favor of silencing women who are harassed or assaulted in the workplace. Nobody raises their hand. And so this is the way that we've been able to change minds, hearts, and souls. And I think it's also because many are realizing that this movement is not a passing fad and it's not going to go away. And this is what is just and moral and humane as a starting point for women and men in the workplace with these particular issues. I always say that this will be my greatest life achievement when this happens, because it will affect millions of workers. And this will be the biggest labor law change, arguably, in the last 100 years. So, you know, hold on, put your seatbelts on. I don't want to jinx it too much. But, and in the Senate, I would just add for wonky Washington people out there that there's something called hotlining a bill, which means that if you have a lot of bipartisan support, instead of needing floor time for a vote, you can actually just put out an email to all 100 senators. And if there are no objections, it actually will pass. And then they just, at a certain point in time, they take all those bills that went through the hotline and they just say, yes, 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 right? So we did that with this bill. We only had 2 objections on the Republican side, Senator Mike Lee and Senator Joni Ernst. I know both of them well, but I know Senator Ernst was this close to getting her on the bill. We eventually got Senator Lee to take his hold off because he just had a language concern. Senator Ernst is the only one still holding this bill in the Senate.
And what is her reluctance?
Well, I believe there may be some reluctance because of the Chamber of Commerce, which is against this legislation. Again, not to get too much into the weeds, but she introduced her own.
Here at AU.
Okay, you like the weeds?
You like weeds. She likes weeds.
The night before Senate Judiciary Committee, she introduced her own piece of legislation that would only eradicate forced arbitration for assault, and gave a bunch of conditions for harassment, which is not okay with what I've been trying to get past, because as much as assault is horrible in the workplace, harassment is happening at a much higher rate. I mean, it's an epidemic with harassment, right? So you're really not addressing the problem by only, but that's what the Chamber of Commerce endorsed and wanted. And they're very powerful on the Hill, especially with Republicans. So it's interesting now because this time around, again, a shift. The Chamber won't publicly come out against my legislation, but they are privately working very hard to try and make sure that it doesn't happen. So that's all that I can guess, but I want to, I have high hopes that Senator Ernst is going to have her questions answered. And as a survivor, especially, and she's been a leader with these types of bills with regard to the military, and high hopes that she's going to take her hold off. And then when it passes in the House on Tuesday, if it could get through the Senate on this hotline, you know, my goodness, it takes Biden's signature, but he said he's going to do it. So then it becomes law.
And what about on the NDA front? Is most of legislation impacting that happening on the state level, and where does that stand?
It is. Yes, thank you for asking that. It is happening at the state level. The first state that actually did the right thing in NDAs was New Jersey. In 2018, New Jersey passed the nation's strongest Nda ban, which effectively prevents companies from enforcing NDAs for anything that's bound by their law against discrimination, which is a mirror of Title VII to some extent at the state level. And then California on January 1st had a law go into effect called the Silence No More Act, which draws a lot from the New Jersey law, which is huge because of obviously the size of California's economy. So in the state of California, you can no longer have any NDAs based on toxic workplace issues. They used to have a law that prevented you just from having NDAs for sexual harassment, and very wisely, a woman named Fomo Zama, who was an employee Pinterest, an African-American woman, lobbied strongly to expand the law to all protected classes. There are other states that have tinkered a little bit on this. New Mexico banned it for sexual harassment and assault. We're working in Massachusetts. Strangely enough, this is a bipartisan issue, but there's also bipartisan opposition. We've been working in Massachusetts for 2 years to ban NDAs simply for anything settled with taxpayer dollars, and have run into resistance from the Democratic speaker and the Republican governor there. So it's interesting that people support this and oppose this in a bipartisan kind of way.
Yeah.
And our next places that we're going to be looking at are Washington State and New York State. So hopefully when we get those states done, it'll be a trend for the rest of the country to follow suit because of the massive amounts of industry in all the states that we've already talked about.
And you were very involved in the New Jersey legislation.
I was involved in New Jersey. Yeah. Because of a bad story. So right around the time that I filed my lawsuit against Fox in 2017, I had been the senior consultant for Governor Murphy of New Jersey, a Democrat who was running for governor at that time. And a lot of women came forward to me and said that they had experienced sexual harassment and another kind of toxic behavior in his campaign. I complained about it to him, or made him aware, not really complained, but made him aware of it and aware of a few other unethical things that I thought were happening in his campaign.
By other campaign staffers.
By other campaign staff, yeah. And for the first and only time in my life, I was actually fired from a job for blowing the whistle. And when I was fired, I was told immediately by his attorneys at Perkins Coie that I was bound by an NDA, a very stringent NDA that I had signed on the first day of employment with him, or my consulting contract with him. I had not realized how extensive it was, much more extensive than I'm bound by at Fox, and that I could not discuss anything that I witnessed on that campaign with anybody. And there was such an uproar because enough women had come forward, including a woman who was sexually assaulted, who wanted me to speak publicly. And I couldn't even acknowledge that I had an NDA. So whenever reporters would call me about it, I would just simply say to them, I can't talk to you about this. And I can't tell you why I can't talk to you about this. There was such a massive uproar that the legislature, overwhelmingly in a bipartisan fashion, put forward an NDA ban in New Jersey that the governor was basically forced to sign. But strangely enough, even after he signed the law into effect, he still bound me by my NDA, because it was retroactive or had predated the law. And as a result of that, there was much more press outrage. And ultimately, he was able to release me from the NDA, which is the only reason I'm able to even talk about all of this with you. But that experience in many ways led the legislature there to really address the NDA issue and become a leader for the rest of the nation based on that experience. So I'm not thrilled that it happened to me, but I'm beyond thrilled that my experience led to this law being passed there, and then that allowed other states to follow suit. So if anybody here listening doesn't think that one person can do something to change the world, Gretchen Carlson was an example for me of somebody who did something to change the world so drastically, and I followed in her footsteps in my small way. And I think a lot of people have to appreciate that no matter the negative experiences you might have, if you channel those into something much more positive and something much more reformist, then you can make something good. You can make lemonade out of the lemons that you're given. And to me, the New Jersey NDA ban really was that lemonade.
Right. And then there's also this more broader scope that comes in on these non-disparagement clauses that people are asked to sign. I know when I left NBC, in order to pay me out on my contract, I had to sign a non-disparage clause so that I could never say anything nasty about anything that happened to me there, right? And that's kind of commonplace. And that's a way, and it's much broader. It's not just sexual harassment. It's anything.
Oh, it's anything.
Disparaging to a company.
Yeah. And what's terrible about the non-disparagement is we have very strong libel laws in this country. And so if you were to say something libelous about somebody at NBC, hypothetically, and it was false, I mean, they have recourse to address that. Exactly. What these non-disparagement clauses do is exist to keep people, whether it's women who are sexually harassed or people of color who are racially discriminated against, I mean, it runs the gamut, from exposing the bad behavior. I mean, it's basically an NDA by another name, and we're not okay. We're not okay with that. We should be able to talk freely about these issues, because if you can't talk freely about these issues, all you're doing is protecting the predator, and you, as the survivor, really have no recourse to do anything about it or to demand change if you can't expose the bad behavior. I just want to add one more thing. I'm sorry, Betsy. I want to add one more thing to this. It's not fun coming forward. I think Gretchen and I can agree. It's really not fun. It's one of the least fun experiences, I think, of my life that I've ever had to do. And so people have to understand, if you're coming forward to talk about these kinds of issues, it's because you almost have no choice, not because you're dying to take somebody down or you're dying to disparage somebody. And these non-disparagement clauses and these NDAs exist to prevent you from doing that, because left to your own devices, unless it gets really bad, you're really not, it's not fun, and you're not going to do it.
Yeah. There's so much talk these days about, good governance being good business for a lot of these big companies. And we hear a lot about sustainability and good governance. And there are some companies that are proactively getting rid of some of these things in employment. But what is the business case as a way to retain and attract talent for big companies to just get rid of this altogether? It's
such a great question. And it's exactly what our work is focused on at Lift Our Voices. we have conversations with companies almost on a daily basis, either companies that have already done the right thing or companies that we think we can change their minds on. But really the movement started after I first introduced the bill in 2017. Microsoft saw that, and 2 weeks later they took out forced arbitration clauses. And then there was a bit of a tidal wave, a small one, in the tech world. If people remember the Google walkout, they remember it, but they don't remember what they were protesting. They were protesting forced arbitration clauses in employment contracts and payouts to predators. And again, power of one person, that was Tanuja Gupta. Her idea, it turned into an international day. Then Google took out forced arbitration. Then, Uber did, and Airbnb is really the shining example of a company that has taken out not only forced arbitration for all toxic workplace issues, but also the kind of NDAs that we're talking about. And we've been in touch with their former general counsel who did this. He wrote a book about it since. He's really been a leader in this, in just taking a chance and doing what he believed to be right. And we wholeheartedly agree with him. I would say that other companies have decided not to be as introspective. To give you some numbers, maybe of the Fortune 1000, maybe 200 of them have gotten rid of forced arbitration, at least for harassment and assault. But when my bill passes, a lot of companies are going to have a rude awakening because they're not going to be able to use that anymore. And what we try to tell them is to get on the right side of history before we force you to do it. We are in an employee market right now. Right. People want to know that where they're going to work is a good place. And by the way, no one is rating companies using our metrics yet, which is also something that we are going to be doing, because you hear about all these studies all the time, 100 best places for women to work, right? Yeah. Well, maybe they're looking at great things like flex time and daycare and paternity leave and all these other things, but nobody's looking at whether or not companies silence their people. And so a lot of these companies that for a long time have been riding high and getting A's, some of them we would give F's to. So we believe that this would be incredibly powerful for to be able to provide this to employees. And this is why we encourage companies to start doing the right thing now. And we're slowly but surely getting them to come over to Lift Our Voices point of view. And it's a slow slog, but it's part of the movement, and it's just one of the tentacles of the work that we're doing.
And I know, Julie, you've talked too before about NDAs just in terms of pay equity and how we see that this impacts people's ability to talk openly about a salary and figure out if there is inequality going on in the workplace.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I signed 2 NDAs in my life. One was a result of my settlement at Fox, but one was as a result of my consulting contract with Governor Murphy. And that NDA was so stringent that I think the direct quote is, you cannot discuss anything with anybody about anything you saw or encountered here whatsoever, which means that if an NDA like that is signed in the workplace and you work at a cubicle next to a white man who's doing the exact same job that you're doing, you can't tell him what you're making. He can't tell you what he's making. And so we don't know whether the man doing the job next to you is making 2 or 3 times more than you are, because you're not allowed to talk about it. And chances are, if a company's enforcing NDAs on you, it's probably not paying their workers equitably as well. That's what we're trying to get to. I mean, these are all issues that we shouldn't cover up. I mean, these are fair issues and questions to ask. If I'm, working on the same widget as the person next to me, performing the same job for the same hours and the same time, should I be getting paid more or less than that person based on my gender, my race, or anything else? Right. So it's not just about toxic workplace issues, although that's what we're fighting against. It's also about extending that to making sure that we have equitable treatment of people in terms of pay or benefits or anything else that we always talk about in the workplace. And as somebody who's worked in politics for almost 30 years, I always find it interesting that legislators who talk about equal pay for equal work, or they talk about gender balance in the workplace, often don't support our proposals. And the question is, well, why not? Because if you want to talk about gender equity, or you want to talk about equal pay for equal work, the fastest way to do that is to allow people to actually talk about their experiences in the workplace, so that we can determine whether the workplaces are treating them fairly or not.
Right. We have a question that came in that is something I wanted to raise anyway, just from a practical standpoint. If a prospective employee were to sign a contract and they recognize that there's this arbitration clause, what is your advice on what they do? I mean, is that something that you can negotiate to get taken out of the contract? Or in many cases, it's just too bad, if you want the job, you have to sign it?
Yeah, I think 3 years ago, you wouldn't have had a choice because there would have been 50 people in the line behind you waiting for that job, and they would have just moved on to the next person. But I'll tell you how prevalent it is. Contracts that come to Julie and me, whether it's for Lift Our Voices, it's so boilerplate now that even though they know our mission, we have forced arbitration clauses in contracts that are sent to us. And we're like, what? And also, you know, NDAs, and we're like, excuse me, we've just been discussing our mission with you for this entire time and you send us a contract with it in it. So obviously we get it taken out. But I want to extend that power. I want to extend that power to anyone who's watching this, because we've cited 2 other examples of the power of one individual and many more that exist, that you have the power. I always say, especially to younger workers and young people in general, that you know, they are much more apt to advocate for social and workplace change. Go with a group of people and say, why do we have these clauses? Could we at least start a conversation about why we have these clauses? Have you heard about the efforts of Gretchen and Julie at Lift Our Voices and the work that they're doing? You know, maybe we should look into this. I've spoken to groups of HR executives to try and get the ball rolling for them, you know, as well. So yes, there's an ability now to ask questions about it, to raise concerns about it. And I think that, you know, it can be effective. I'm not going to say it's going to work in every situation, but I do think that the time is especially ripe right now in this employee-driven market.
We also have a question along those same lines from Roseanne, who asked how we can most effectively get involved with the organization.
Call us. We would love for you to get involved. Liftourvoices.org. I mean, please email us. Our emails are Gretchen.Carlson at liftourvoices.org, Julie.Roginsky at liftourvoices.org. Get in touch and we will put you to work. We would love to build a movement of people who believe in our mission and really want to go out there and talk to their legislators, or talk to their offices, or talk to their whoever they want to talk to, their organizations, about why this is the right thing to do. There's legislation on the Hill. There's legislation in different states. There are organizations that you belong to. The more people who number in this movement, the more people we can have to create change. So please just get in touch.
And I would just say that today I posted a video on all my social media channels at Gretchen Carlson as a survivor about this bill and the upcoming vote, and ask people to reshare it, repost it, and also the script if you are a survivor and you also want to create the same video. This is, you know, there's power in numbers, especially social media has been so important in this movement. And so it just happened today that I posted this. Please feel free to share and repost and create your own video.
And one more thing, if I could just add, you know, this is for the men out there. We need you guys. Gretchen and I always say that we're doing this for our boys. We both have sons, and it's important for us to raise our boys to understand that this could not continue. Men, for better or worse, are still in charge most places in this country, and we cannot do this without men. So please, if you are a man, come join us. Talk to other men that you know, and really, this is not just for survivors. It's not just for women. It's not just for people of color or people who've been disenfranchised. It's for everybody, and especially male allies who really can help us effectuate that change.
Someone else in the audience is asking what the bill number is.
Yeah, thank you so much. In the House, it's HR 4445, so HR 4445. And in the Senate, it's S 2342, S 2342. Unbelievably, it's the exact same language, even with some amendments that have happened, which is, you guys all understand this because you follow Washington, but that's really, really important because it helps it to pass out quickly in both chambers. So the bill is very easy to read. If you go to Congress.gov and look up either of those numbers, it's literally 2.5 pages long. It's narrow in scope on purpose to try to get people on board as possible.
That's great. or what kind of research are you all doing? Someone's asking if you all publicize a running list of companies that have removed these NDA or arbitration clauses so that people are aware. What other research needs to be done? Where do you see that movement going in terms of?
Wow, if we had 5 hours, I could really walk out on this because this is my cup of tea. But the reality is there's very scant research that's been done on this. There's a professor named Alexander Coleman up at Cornell who's done incredible work on this, a woman, Mina Kotkin at Brooklyn Law, who's done great work on NDAs. But the reality is, for the most part, there hasn't been the kind of research conducted that needs to be conducted. And that's really a huge part of our mission at Lift Our Voices. We really want to quantify the numbers of people who are affected by these silencing mechanisms, and not just forced arbitration and NDAs, but the no rehire provisions that we talked about. Betsy, you'd mentioned the non-disparagement clauses. I mean, there's a whole ecosystem legally that exists to really prevent survivors from talking about their issues or from holding predators accountable. So that's one. We really want to qualify it by doing qualitative research to understand both awareness of these issues, which we think are not as deep as we'd like them to be, and also awareness of solutions to this. And then there's states research that we'd like to do in the states. For example, New Jersey, because they did pass this law in 2018, there's 4 years of data that exists that nobody's ever bothered to research to see whether New Jersey getting rid of this NDA, getting rid of these NDAs for toxic workplace issues, whether that's actually affected in any positive or negative way the bottom line of their companies. The entire pharmaceutical industry, for example, is based in New Jersey. Has it affected them? I mean, I would argue that the answer is no, but it'd be helpful to quantify that so that other companies and other states understood there's really no downside to doing this. Another thread of research that we'd love to do is see if there's a correlation between companies that use these silencing mechanisms and their ability to retain women and people of color. There have been studies conducted that say that companies that do have women and people of color do better. Their financial bottom line is just better for having a diverse workforce. And it'd be interesting to see if there's a correlation between having these silencing mechanisms and the company's ability to retain a diverse workforce. So there's so many different rabbit holes that I could go down right now on research, but that's all really critical research to really prove our point. And I think that if we have this research done, which is what we're raising money to do right now, it'll be a lot easier for us to convince companies, legislators, other stakeholders that this is the right thing to do.
Because if there is a business case for it,
sure,
that's when things start to change at the end of the day, right?
Yep. Of course.
Yeah. We have a question from Manuel who asks, what advice do you have for someone starting a business to start off on the right path?
Great question. So actually on our website at liftourvoices.org, we have the legal template for what you should put in your contract for the kind of NDAs we're talking about and forced arbitration. So the NDA language, one paragraph, it protects the company from trade secrets and proprietary information, which we believe all companies should be able to protect, obviously. Right. And then, but it doesn't preclude people from being able to talk about horrible things that might happen to them. And then the forced arbitration clause is, not allowing it to cover toxic workplace issues. So if you go to our website, actually, if our executive director is on the call, maybe she could put that from our website into the chat for people so that they could see that language, or I can try and do it while Julie's answering a question.
We also have for your executive director, someone asking if you all are hiring because this person is empowered and inspired by this conversation. So you might have some, if you all have a career board, job openings, put that in there too, because people are interested in that. 2 questions.
For all the research, yes.
Yeah. 2 more general questions on sexual harassment at large. Hannah is asking, how would you suggest working toward dismantling the social barriers toward victims coming forward with their stories? For example, people may be getting blacklisted from fields, public harassment in person, but especially online, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're culturally trying to change as well.
Mm-hmm.
So once we get done with these silver bullet solutions of eradicating these silencing mechanisms, and at the same time, moving on to change culturally what happens to a person when they come forward at work. So typically what happens now is somebody comes forward, they're automatically the troublemaker. They're the pariah. The workplace is like, oh, how do we get rid of this person, right? And so we're going to shunt them off to secrecy, and oh, I hope they have an arbitration clause so that nobody ever hears from them ever again. But they never work again. What we're trying to change is the way that we approach this stigma, which is, okay, so somebody comes forward, you do an independent investigation, not HR, because that deck is stacked against you from the beginning too. They're paid by the company, so it's not a fair process. Now, if the to be telling the truth independently, then they just get to keep working. Like, imagine that all the women that I've spoken to over time, the only thing they wanted, two things. They wanted an apology and they wanted to keep working. Right. That's it. And instead, we're pushing all these women out because we immediately react to them being the troublemaker. So what we need are enlightened leaders in companies, which most of them are men. We need them to be enlightened on this, to respect and celebrate people who have the courage to come forward, change the inner system of how they handle this, do independent investigations, let the person just keep working, get rid of the bad apple. Now, guess what you don't need? Settlements, NDAs, forced arbitration clauses, secrecy, right. Pushing people. You don't need any of that. And you retain the exact people that increase your bottom line. Right. So, culturally,
how much money is being spent on payouts from settlements?
Well, that's the other thing. And so we're also involved in shareholder advocacy as well. As I always say, it's a tangled web to fix this issue. So we're like doing everything. But shareholder activism is also a big thing in the last year on these issues, because investors are now becoming much more educated on this. And just as much as they want more women and people of color on boards, they also don't want companies to silence their people. And so, if you want to look up, there was a story about the Goldman Sachs annual shareholder meeting that I attended at the end of April, where we got a proposal on the ballot for them to have to examine their use of forced arbitration. The board voted unanimously against us, but 53% of shareholders voted with us. And that was a huge wake-up call. And 3 weeks later, Goldman reversed their stance and decided to examine their use of arbitration. So this is a new area of influence and shareholders. So don't just throw away your proxy votes if you own shares in companies. Actually look at what the proposals are and vote to get rid of some of these concealment clauses.
Along those same lines, we also have a question from June, who's asking how victims of sexual harassment can affect change in the workplace that causes the perpetrators to learn from and change their behavior.
Well, the first thing you should do is, and this is hard because a lot of companies do this, a lot of organizations do this, but it's about retaliation, right? Like you come forward to complain about sexual harassment, and the first thing that the company does is figure out a way to retaliate against you, basically to make you pay for coming forward, which is either that they stick you in a secret chamber like arbitration, or they slap you with an NDA immediately so that you can't discuss this with anybody, which precludes you then from potentially getting another job going forward, because as I said earlier, you have to explain why you left your previous one and you can't. All those things are something that we have to culturally address. And so, June, if you want to figure out how to avoid being sexually harassed, or how to change the culture at your job, the first thing I think you need to do, if you don't have a lawyer, is to just put a marker down that whatever you do, you demand and you expect that there's no retaliation. There's no whistleblower retaliation for you blowing the whistle on bad behavior. I don't know where you live and I don't know what the laws in your state are, but a lot of states have these kinds of laws that prevent people from doing that to you. But I think that's a very important marker that I wish more people were aware of. If I could use them. And the media has a lot to learn from this as well, because I remember watching the Andrew Cuomo debacle of the last 6 months. And what was astounding to me when his accusers came out is not so much what they said, because sadly it's not too uncommon, but it was the way the media handled it. It became a he said, she said story consistently, as opposed to the media writing what I thought the real story was, in addition to the allegations, which was simply his accuser came forward and immediately the governor's staff dumps a bunch of redacted, selective internal documents on the media to try to discredit her. And the media didn't write about that. The media didn't write about the fact that this was just a blatant act of retaliation, regardless of whether her claims had credibility or not. The very fact that this was being done to her was an act of retaliation that had nothing whatsoever to do with her claims. And so I think there's a lot that the media and our society at large has to learn about how these things are handled, and not to position this as a he said one thing and she said something else. It's about the fact that somebody should have the ability to come forward and their claims should be investigated independently.
Let me just add to that, Julie. I want to add to that because I saw a question in the chat too about the news today that Brian Flores came forward, the former Miami Dolphins football coach who's African-American, who with a lawsuit against the NFL. And the question is like, what can be done about changing culture and systems that often keep people silent because of the risk of losing their careers? I just want to focus on how the media, because Julie tweeted about this and then I retweeted her today. The media is culpable in this. And I can say that as a journalist, because when I saw this interview this morning, 4 times Brian Flores was asked, well, you realize that coming forward, you're probably never going to work again in the NFL. And I was just screaming at the television because that promulgates the whole idea that people who come forward with courage, that they never work again. And instead, and luckily the lawyer finally said next to them, we hope that this is an opportunity for the NFL to do the right thing and to hire more African-American coaches, right? And to hire Brian Flores today. And the same thing could be said for all of these women who fear coming forward because they're not going to work again. But as a member of the media, we have to stop asking the old school questions of the way we think about this because it promotes the stigma. Same thing with when somebody like Bill O'Reilly falls, right? The very first question out of the gate, like the next day, is when will Bill O'Reilly be making his comeback? And it's like, what? Like, why do we automatically go to that? We don't ask this question. Where the hell are all the women who have lost their jobs because they simply had the courage to come forward? Where are they? And when are they coming back? And so we need to, as members of the media, also retrain our brains and the stigmas and the bias in which we've been raised as to the questions that we ask. And I would just say that social media and the media in general, they've also been incredible partners in all of this too, because had it not been for both, these stories would never have come to light and more stories would never have come to light. So I'm just offering some encouraging,
good and bad.
Encouraging words to try and move the ball forward with us too, and don't get stuck in those old school ways of looking at things.
Yeah. Kendall has a question. How does your organization extend to LGBTQ and trans people that face workplace discrimination and harassment at an even higher rate?
Great question. And I just want to be very clear, lift our voices just because we experience sexual harassment ourselves. And I'm not even sure if I can say that without violating my NDA, but I just did, which just goes to show how crazy it is. But it doesn't mean that we don't think that this should extend to everybody. So this is not just about Julie and Gretchen. This is about people of color who are racially discriminated against, members of the LGBTQI communities who face awful discrimination. Certainly the trans community, there's horror story after horror story every day about the issues that community faces. So it's about all toxic workplace issues. And absolutely, we believe that all anybody wants to do, regardless of race, sexual orientation, gender, religion, I mean, whatever your status is, all we want to do is work, right? All everybody wants to do is just go to work in a respectful workplace and go home having done a good job. Nobody wants to deal with this, and nobody should deal with this. And what we're trying to make sure is that we create a workplace around in this country that is fair and equitable to everybody, regardless of who you are. And obviously that includes the LGBTQ community and everybody else that I just mentioned.
Let's see, I think we have time for one more question. This one just came in about how is your organization collaborating, or is your organization collaborating on the recent efforts to end sexual assault in the military? is that something that you all are involved in?
Yeah, I wrote about it extensively in my book, Be Fierce, which was really a handbook for anyone facing harassment in the workplace, but focused a lot about the efforts that were being done on the Hill with regard to assault in the military and harassment. I mean, it's rampant for women, both of those things, unfortunately. A lot of the women who reached out to me were members of the military with horrific stories. I mean, one that stands out was a woman she was actually the commander, and the men who were her subordinates would say to her at night, wave a dollar in front of her and say, dance for us. And when she went to complain about it to her superior, actually they waved a $10 bill, or no, $1 bill. And the commander or her superior said to her, I thought that you were worth at least 10. I mean, that's the kind of mentality that I think it's probably more pervasive in the military than even in the workplace. So certainly we're always thinking about our members of the military, and we've heard horrific stories from them. There has been some legislation that's passed that's also on the horizon to pass to make changes to try and take it out of the military command to prosecute these kinds of cases, because there's inherent bias. And I think that there's argument on both sides of the fence, but I actually agree with taking it out, just like I do independent investigations in the workplace.
Great. Well, Gretchen and Julie, I just want to thank you both so much for coming on tonight and sharing all of the work that you're doing. And we'll be watching your legislation next week and in the weeks to come, Gretchen. So congratulations on all that you all have been able to accomplish. And I'm sure there's much more coming. So we really appreciate you spending some time with us tonight.
Thank you so much, Betsy. Thanks to everybody watching as well.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for tuning in. I want to let folks know that we are going to be back in 2 weeks on February 16th with Maggie Krell, who is the author of a new book called Taking Down Backpage, Fighting the World's Largest Sex Trafficker. So we'll talk about her experience as a prosecutor in taking down Backpage and the criminal case that is pending against them as a sex trafficker. So hope you all will be able to tune in for that next Wednesday. We'll put a link in the chat and you can register on our Women in Politics Institute website as well. And so we hope to see you then, and hope everyone has a good night, and thanks again.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Betsy.
Bye-bye.
Bye.